Hi everyone, and welcome to the third video in my series about Soviet tank destroyers. We already talked about tank destroyer crews composed of infantry who threw grenades or Molotov cocktails, and tank destroyers was a term used to refer to tanks that were not specifically designed as tank destroyers necessarily, but ended up pretty good at destroying enemy tanks. Today we're going to talk about something that many of you are going to recognize as a tank destroyer instantly, or these guys. So this is an Su-100. As you can see, big gun, fixed casemate. If you've played World of Tanks, the Soviet tank destroyer tree is full of vehicles like this. So it's reasonable to assume that these are called tank destroyers. Well, let's talk about that. I think I'll start with a brief history of the Soviet tank destroyer. So it actually started in June of 1940 when the T-34 just went into production. An idea came up to create a tank destroyer that used an 85mm AA gun, the 52K, kind of similar to what the Germans did with the 88mm flak guns. So the Soviet gun was also, it had a similar ancestry to German AA guns. It fired a fairly powerful 85mm round. Later on, this was the gun that was used in the IS and T-34-85. But way before all that, the idea came up in June of 1940 to create a turreted tank destroyer, actually, using this gun. So there were two designs that made it to sort of the concept phase. You had the U-20 and the U-22. The biggest difference between them was that one just used the AA gun as is, and one modified the AA gun to fit in a more or less reasonable turret. Neither one of these really got off the ground, but there were the definitions, at the very least, of requirements of a tank destroyer with a fixed casemate and an 85mm gun on the T-34 chassis. But I haven't seen any kind of blueprints or drawings for those just requirements. As the Great Patriotic War went on, there seems to be not really any requirement for a tank destroyer. The standard T-34 seemed to be enough, and the next vehicle to be developed on the T-34 chassis was the Su-122, which was armed with a low-velocity howitzer. It was an 122mm howitzer, so it was quite potent against enemy tanks, but not really a tank destroyer. Everything changed in the spring of 1943 when the Tiger tank was first tested. It turned out that most Soviet anti-tank guns couldn't penetrate its armor, and so this caused quite a stir among the tank artillery design bureaus. For one, the T-34 tank destroyer with the 57mm gun that I talked about in the previous video was revived. Production of the 57mm ZIS-2 gun was revived. Special ammunition was developed for numerous tank guns and anti-tank guns. But what we really care about is that several tank destroyers were ordered as a response to the Tiger, and one of these was an 85mm gun on the T-34 tank chassis. Now, what they wanted was a rear casemate like the Su-76. That didn't really pan out. The result was pretty much the same concept as an Su-122, so front fighting compartment, big gun sticking out the front. This turned into the Su-85. It was accepted into production in August of 1943. In July of 1944, it was replaced by this guy, the Su-100. More or less the same concept, so casemate fighting compartment in the front of the vehicle here. Really, the only major change, aside from adding a gun, was the commander's cupola here. But Su-85M tank destroyers also had the commander's cupola. So this sort of became the classic Soviet tank destroyer design. Now, they weren't called tank destroyers specifically, so the SU just stands for Samohodная Ustanovka, or self-propelled carriage, similar to how the Americans called their tank destroyer GMC, gun motor carriage. However, the way that they were organized were very much in a tank destroyer fashion. So the Su-85 was organized in an SPG regiment. So 21 vehicles per unit. First, it was 20 Su-85s split into 4 batteries of 5 vehicles each, with a commander in a T-34 tank. Later on, the commander got his own Su-85. With the Su-100, it didn't really change. The same structure was followed. Now, these weren't explicitly anti-tank units. So in the Soviet Army, or in the Red Army rather, anti-tank units had very specific designations. The troops that fought in them had a special sleeve patch, so it was quite prestigious to be in one of these units. And so the self-propelled gun units weren't anti-tank units. However, they were attached to anti-tank brigades. And so in terms of how they were designed and how they were used, it was quite clear that these were, in fact, tank destroyers. Now, again, if you played World of Tanks, you would see that once you get high enough in the tech tree, you get to research this guy. This is an ISU-152. Well, you get to go through the SU-152 first. And, well, it's designated as a tank destroyer. It has the same thing. Big gun on the front, frontal casemate here. This one's built on the IS tank chassis, but the first ones were built on the KV-1S chassis. But the question is this also a tank destroyer? Well, the answer is, again, a little bit complicated. So let's talk about where the Su-152 takes its roots from. Way back in the Winter War, the USSR determined that it needed a powerful 152mm gun, specifically gun, not a howitzer like on the KV-2, to break through enemy fortifications. Now, by the time any of these guns were developed, the war was over, so development wasn't really rushed at all. There was the Object 212 SPG, which was based on the KV-3 chassis, but as the KV-3 died, so did the 212, and really the Red Army never ended up with an acceptable 152mm gun on a self-propelled chassis. So in the fall of 1941, Stalin actually ordered that an assault gun be built on a KV chassis. So this assault gun didn't have a 152mm gun. It had a quite interesting combination of weapons. It had one 76mm gun and two 45mm guns arranged all in the same mount. Later on, this was replaced with two 76mm guns, and the idea was that this increased the density of fire, so this assault gun would, break through enemy lines and just put a ton of high explosives downrange, firing multiple guns at the same time. Of course, this idea was absurd. Even though it was suggested personally by Stalin, it was never really had a high priority of development, and the idea was really dropped in mid-1942. However, a bunch of hulls had already been built, so it was reasonable to design an assault gun that used this kind of thing. And this is when the idea of putting a 152mm gun howitzer, the ML-20, into these hulls. The Su-152 isn't a direct descendant of the KV-7, but it's the same idea as you take an ML-20 gun howitzer and you put it in a casemate on by then it was already the KV-1S tank. The ML-20 wasn't as powerful as the Red Army wanted, but if you wanted a BR-2, a 152mm gun in an armored casemate, there were projects to do this, and the weight was just ridiculous. This thing would be way too heavy by anybody's standards. So the Su-152 was a compromise. These Su-152s were formed into heavy self-propelled artillery regiments. So again, not a tank destroyer unit, and they were intended to be assault guns. Their primary design was to destroy fortifications, to destroy enemy infantry. They didn't even have an AP shell developed for them, so it's very difficult to claim that the Su-152 was designed as a tank destroyer. And to kind of add some nails to that coffin, you had, when the decree came out requesting tank destroyers to be developed in response to the Tiger, one of the requests was to put a 122mm A-19 gun into an Su-152. To develop a tank destroyer on the Su-152 chassis, that kind of seals the deal, right? It was not a tank destroyer. However, in the first battles that the Su-152s fought were at Kursk. The Su-152 regiment that was used there ran into quite a number of German tanks, including Tigers, and then it turned out that the 43 kilogram HE shell that it fired, yeah, sure, it wasn't an AP shell and it wasn't an optimal penetrator, but when your tank gets smacked with a 43 kilogram shell, regardless of what kind of shell it is, it's not going anywhere. So there were two Su-152s with personal names, Zuber and Zeraboy. Zeraboy is translated as Beast Slayer, or Beast Killer, or Beast Hunter. The meaning behind all these translations is the same, but this vehicle excelled. So the crew of this vehicle excelled in destroying German tanks, and so the nickname given to this one specific vehicle migrated to all Su-152s. Now, this nickname was never used towards ISU-152s, so the descendant of the Su-152. It only applied to the Su-152, and it was even used in official sources to refer to it as such. Despite its success against German tanks, the Su-152 and its descendant, the ISU-152, they were still used in these heavy SPG regiments, so they weren't reclassified as tank destroyers. The organization didn't really change, but the power of the 152mm gun against German tanks was definitely noted, and it was definitely included in manuals. And a armor-piercing shell was developed for the ISU-152, but really there wasn't any sense in using it when the regular HE shell was quite potent against enemy armor anyway. Now, let's get back to the ISU-122. So, as I said earlier, a tank destroyer on the Su-152 chassis was ordered after the Red Army familiarized itself with the Tiger tank. However, this was a kind of a low-priority project, and nothing really happened until production of the KV-1S, and therefore the Su-152 was replaced with the IS tank, and therefore the ISU-152. There was no longer any point in putting a 122mm gun in an Su-152, and this ISU-152 with a 122mm gun was built only in December of 1943. Trials naturally followed, and it was accepted into service in the spring of 1944 as the ISU-122, a slightly different version with the improved T-25S gun was accepted later as the ISU-122S. These were made to be tank destroyers. The list of advantages over the ISU-152 includes things like rate of fire and greater maximum range, but the greater effectiveness against enemy tanks and firing at moving targets was listed up front, so it's quite clear what kind of vehicle this was supposed to be. Interestingly enough, even though the ISU-122 and ISU-122S were explicitly designed to fight enemy tanks, they were still included into the same kind of heavy self-propelled gun regiment as the ISU-152. So the organizational structure didn't explicitly reflect the fact that it was a tank destroyer. However, there were heavy tank brigades composed of the two IS tank regiments and one ISU-122 regiment, and these were specifically built, even though, again, they weren't officially named anti-tank brigades, which was a very specific and prestigious title, but these were heavy tank brigades that were formed for the express purpose of fighting enemy heavy tanks, and these included the IS-2 and the ISU-122. So it wasn't officially designated a tank destroyer, but it was used for the purpose of destroying tanks. So, to review, the Su-85 and Su-100, it was explicitly designed as a tank destroyer from the very beginning, and it was used as such in anti-tank brigades. And the Su-152, ISU-152, they were not designed to be tank destroyers, but they were quite potent when used as tank destroyers in the field, and so their anti-tank aimed descendants, the ISU-122 and the ISU-122S. They were specifically used in an anti-tank role, but again, never got that tank destroyer designation. Whether or not something was designated as a tank destroyer in the Red Army was kind of arbitrary. It mostly depended on what the vehicle was designed to do in the first place, rather than what it ended up doing on the battlefield. There are, of course, many different definitions of what a tank destroyer is, and hopefully this chart will help you figure out whether or not you're all on the same page.